I also want to remind us that the Bible says very clearly, above all these things, put on charity. It lists a whole bunch of things in Colossians. And then tells us in chapter 3, above all these things, put on charity, which is the bond of perfectness. In Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, owe no man anything but to love one another. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. For this thou shalt commit no... This is the same book, okay? Where Paul, in Romans chapter 3, you know what he's saying in Romans chapter 3? All that stuff, all will be guilty before God. He's basically saying the same thing that James is saying. James says it much more concisely. If, though you follow the whole law, yet offend in one point, you're guilty of breaking the whole law. Okay? Now, James says that very concisely. And Paul takes a whole chapter to say the same sentiment. Okay? He's a little more verbose, a little more wordy than James is, but it's the same concept. And the same guy who wrote Romans chapter 3 says, for he that loveth his brother hath fulfilled the law. Take that back to Romans chapter 3. You know what the problem with Romans chapter 3 is with people? They never read Romans 13. They never saw where Paul was going with it. And that's the problem we have. For this thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet, and if there be any other commandment, is briefly comprehended in the saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That's the brief comprehension of all that together. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Same guy that wrote Romans 3 wrote that. Okay? Calvinist wants to debate you over Romans 3, take him to Romans 13, see what he says about that. Okay? Because you may not understand this, but, you know, Romans has 16 chapters in it. And when the guy's in chapter 3, maybe he's not done yet. Maybe he's getting to a point that he hasn't made yet. Maybe you need to read the rest of the book before you start writing some silly, stupid doctrine about Romans chapter 3. Are you following me? Now, the end of the commandment, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5 through 6, Paul tells Timothy, now the end of the commandment, and we would say that in the military, the desired end state, what we're getting to with all of this is charity out of a pure heart and of a good conscience and faith unfeigned. So that's the summary statement at the beginning of the book 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 5 through 6. And remember, Timothy, Titus, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus have the highest concentration of the word doctrine in them. Now, we believe in doctrine here. It's just not propositionally encapsulated. It's doctrine, think of the Monroe Doctrine, the Bush Doctrine, okay? The Truman Doctrine. It's a policy, principle, or procedure by which a person operates. That's what doctrine is. It's procedural, perspectival, and participatory. It is not propositional. The proposition is necessary to teach the doctrine, but the teaching of the doctrine is not the doctrine. The performance of the doctrine is the doctrine. So we believe in doctrine here, and we believe that it can be transmitted propositionally. But the propositional transmission is not the doctrine any more than the money for the house is the house, or the money for the car is the car, or the money for the groceries is the groceries, even though it can be exchanged for such, presuming everybody agrees on both sides. So propositions about doctrines can accurately transmit doctrines that are about policies, principles, or procedures if both people agree and understand that those propositions point to those things. Okay? Doctrines are not the propositions. Doctrines are the policies, principles, or procedures. We use propositions to teach the doctrines, which must be acted out. Okay? And then he says, from which some having swerved have turned aside into vain jangling. Okay? And faith, okay, that's we don't want to do that. We want to keep charity. And Paul puts charity as greater than faith and hope at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Peter says, if you don't like Paul's word for it, Peter says, above all things have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover a multitude of sins. And that cover a multitude of sins is not in a salvation sense, but in an interactive sense on how people get along. in 1 Corinthians 1:21, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, it says, the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. Now, those of us who are in 2023, I think that would be everybody listening right now. Our society has come through some various different things where we've come into the modern era. And then they call that like maybe the age of the radio. And then we've gone into the postmodern era, right around after World War II or so, Foucault and Derrida. And then we're getting into the meta-modern cultural era, okay, where things are a little different. But the modern era, for example, is all about building everything up, building the biggest building, leaving a name for yourself, leaving the legacy. That was the modern era. And the pattern that we're going to see in the embodied gospel is order, disorder, reorder. People from the modern era do not understand that. It is absolutely foolishness to them. You just build up higher, bigger, stronger, more legendary. Make a name for yourself, okay? And so this would be foolishness to them. And we have this pattern over here, life, death, resurrection, is the way that Christ embodied the actual gospel that we believe. He lived a life, he died, he was buried, and he rose again, okay? And the abstracted pattern of that we are to embody every day is we pursue order, we encounter disorder, some kind of failure, and through that failure, we come into a reorder that is better than the previous order. Now, the way the wisdom of men is to avoid all failure. Avoid all failure. But the wisdom of God is that through failure comes resurrection. And that resurrection is what we need. Now, in the Christian life, when we embody the gospel, we live that cycle of order, disorder, reorder, life, death, resurrection, over and over and over. Job, get fired, better job, something like that, okay? But some things that are sometimes much more serious. Things with your kids, things with mental health, things with major failures, families coming apart, diseases, okay? Life, death, resurrection. It happens at every level. So the gospel, remember, the gospel is fractal. There could be life, death, resurrection cycles that are longer than your lifetime. And there could be some that take less than 10 minutes to play out. And throughout your life, there will probably be multiple cycles of this pattern in your life. Most people encounter at least one major dark night of the soul. And if you attend to it properly, that could be the catalyst to get you into a major resurrection cycle and perhaps launch you into, second-tier consciousness. If you take someone like Mr. Miyagi from Karate Kid, you have a very simple person, or he lives a simple life, is what I'm trying to say. He's a repairman, maintenance man. But even though he has a lot of his life behind him, he's still willing to commit effort and energy into Danielson. And then later on in the show, you find out that he has a very sad, dark night of the soul that he went through, where he lost his wife. And it was the anniversary of him and his wife had died. And it looked like, from how he was, if you would call it celebrating or mourning that situation, that he wasn't quite over it. And those who go through a death cycle in your life, death, resurrection, you'll see that people who have genuine wisdom, they also carry with them a sadness in their eyes from the dark night of the soul that they went through. And other people see that. Danielson walks in and he sees him with the picture of his wife up there, singing songs and being sad and crying and having a drink. And Jesus came back from his resurrection cycle. Even though the resurrection cycle was over, you could still look back on the past wounds, and he showed his hands and his feet and how the wounds are still visible to other people. But he came out of them. And when you go through a resurrection cycle, you'll have a kind sadness in your eyes where you are happy and blessed and have a higher level of consciousness, and you can see more clearly. But the wounds that got you there are still visible to people, and it's okay to show them to people, to let them see, to embody the gospel, to let them see the cross that you had to carry to get where you are. It's okay. It happens.